The graph for fetid Moppet searches should show a substantial upward trend right after the end of Goodbye Mrs. Selvig's airing. The title pairs with the first episode's Hello Ms. Cobell and is a play on the show's two mostly separate stories. When you realize the first episode of Severance's second season focuses entirely on the one that takes place inside, following the innies as they sort out the aftermath of the OTC, it's a safe bet to assume that the second would flip this around and take place on the outside. Also, several interviews hinted that they would pick up right where things left off after the Outies woke up. Episode 2 pretty much does that, at least in that we see Mark immediately after he screamed she's alive holding his wedding photo at the end of season 1. They do hold some information back. We don't know what happened when Britt, or presumably his husband, opens the door for the stranger who's banging on it, and Dylan appears to have just been given an ice bag for his head before being put in the elevator. To be sure, there are some things to ponder there, but we do catch up with them at home before too much time passes. Having things split up like this provides lots of chances to insert details that make you feel like you're being rewarded for paying attention, which is something I'm a sucker for. In the live stream after episode 1, the lack of staggering when the team returned made us wonder if their Outies might encounter each other before they went down. Instead, we see them arrive at the elevator one after the other. And that leads you to replay their arrivals in episode 1 back in your head, tying everything together. The other thing splitting things up for the entire episode does is reinforce just how cut off the two worlds are from each other. The two sides of each of these people. Nowhere is that more relevant than at Rickon's place, where we get a reverse ollie shot of his head as Outie Mark wakes up. There's a reminder of how close he is with his sister Devin as she checks in to see if it's really him. When she asks what her name is, he answers Persephone, the goddess of the underworld who also functions as a vegetation goddess. The story of how she took on that dual role may be something that comes back up, but it's not something I think I need to get into right now. After that, he looks at the wedding photo he's holding, an image we know is innie carried with him in his memory down to the severed floor. In my episode 1 recap, I mentioned that I was happy to see them address the questions we've been thinking about during the show's long absence between seasons. How does finding out about Ms. KC change things for Mark S? And how is their work connected to the revelation that she appears to be alive on the testing floor? Reintegration was one of the things I was most curious about in Mark's story on the outside. Rather than have him run to Ragabi and get that started, it seems like the show introduced a roadblock in Devon's newfound interest in what's happening on the severed floor. Before we get to that, I found 2 surprising things in the online discussion after episode 1 came out. Well, 3, but we'll pick up the last one when we discuss Helena. First, I couldn't believe how many people took Milchek at his word about 5 months passing. This came off as suspect, if not an obvious lie, so I was surprised to see so many people's accounts of the situation taking that as fact. The second is related since it only works if some time passed, and that's the idea that Mark in episode 1 had already started reintegration. I was looking but didn't see any evidence of this. He was disoriented when he first came down, but that also works because he just found out someone who was supposed to be dead is alive in his office. He has a flash of the wedding photo during the ball game, but that's something he saw himself and doesn't require any Outie memories to have that happen. I believe reintegration is coming and is the natural next step, but now episode 2 has me wondering how Devon will fit into that. After the insane new opening credit sequence prompted me to ask out loud, was that a baby with Kier's head on it? We're reminded that Rickon's presence heightens every scene he's in. I have to say, he really is a jewel. Rebecca also kept herself relevant by commenting they shouldn't punish the baby because it wasn't its fault. And there's a spirited exchange about save versus found. This is all fun, but it's coming on the heels of this bizarre event where Mark's innie came out, and everyone's reactions go in different directions. Mark doesn't want to entertain the idea that what he said was related to his dead ex-wife, and why would he? Rickon steers things towards finding the baby. Even though Devon agrees that him saying she's alive being about their daughter is the simplest and most likely best explanation for what happened, it doesn't look like she can leave it there. And to be fair, it doesn't seem like it would be easy to do. On top of coining the term Selbig, Rickon points out the great lengths that Mark's work personage went to alert them to abuses that are taking place at Lumon. He derails a little, bringing up how the profundity of his book inspired the MDRs, but the abuses are something that will keep Devin interested beyond the Gemma situation. As they talk and that keeps coming back up, some tension develops between the siblings, but Milchek arrives to interrupt things before it goes too far. He's doing damage control and has been instructed to let Kier guide his hand regarding firing the Macrodats if necessary. He sees Irv first, who lies about being home watching TV all night. Seth subtly gives him chances to acknowledge what happened, but then fires him when he keeps trying to play it off. He adds that it's difficult because he's close with his innie, a man of principle, but doesn't budge or explain things further when Irv tries to change his mind. The exchange with Dylan is less involved, likely because we don't spend much time with his outie until later in the episode. Milchek tells him he got into a fight where he was the aggressor, which there is some truth there because that's what happened when Dylan bit him last season. And all he says here is, "What am I supposed to tell my wife?" There's a notable difference in how he approaches Mark, and it stood out that he never seemed to consider firing him. He tells them what happens and explains the OTC to everyone. He looks slightly suspicious of Devin, who had contact with Harmony and Mark's innie, but is otherwise just there doing his job. He sticks with the same story he used on Mark's innie in episode 1, blaming everything on Cobell. Devin is somewhat sympathetic here because of the lactation consultant thing. Milchek inquires about what was said at the party, but seems more focused on moving on from the incident and getting Mark back into the office. He doesn't seem any more open to that than he does about entertaining ideas about his dead wife, so Seth leaves him with the idea that what his innie did may have been unauthorized, but it was also brave. He'd hate to reward his courage with non-existence. It's worth mentioning that in the first season, Mark was only starting to grapple with the idea that the severance procedure creating a different work version of him was something he needed to consider. This came from other people's perspectives, as he needed to believe it was harmless and was helping him because the alternative seemed unbearable. When he gets home, he tries to speak to Mrs. Selvig, but there's no answer when he knocks on her door, even though her white rabbit's parked outside. By the time he wakes up the next day, he's pretty set on quitting. Devin sends him a message, and they meet at Pip's where she tries to talk him out of it. This primarily serves to reinforce what I already said about their positions, and the divide over what his innie set. She focuses on the abuses initially, but it becomes apparent that she wants confirmation of what she's alive really means. This opens the door for Mark to give us some details about Gemma's death while he's making it plain that Devin needs to stop pushing him. He says he identified her body that apparently burned in the accident. That fact leaves the possibility of some body swapping shenanigans on the table. He brings up having to tell her parents and students and how his sheets smelled like her for weeks after she was gone, and takes offense at the idea of her death affecting Devin too. She doesn't really have a great argument except she wants to know, and he ends up walking away mad, but seeds have been planted. Not just in that Devin won't likely stop trying, but also even though he can't confront it, some of what she's saying has to be getting through to him. He never mentions reintegration since their conflict has him firmly on the side of quitting, but I also have a sense that it wouldn't line up with how she wants to approach things. As he walks away, we see that the new character, Mr. Drummond, who has a frolic tattoo on his hand and who we'll come back to in a minute, is sitting nearby listening to their conversation. Things get more complicated for Mark later that night. After watching Cobell's house and not seeing any signs of her, he finally decides to change the light bulb she brought up last season in his hall, but Milchek shows up to interrupt him again. This time he's bearing a fruit basket with a pineapple. I don't know if it means anything, but that is the second episode in a row where one of those came up. He tries to convince him to return to the office. There's an offer of a nice raise and wellness checks from an outside organization, and he says that those are just the beginning. Things take a turn when he says he has a final question that confirms his wife, Gemma. He reminds him of his initial interview and how sad he was, and how he said that every day felt like a year since his wife died, and he felt like he was choking on her ghost. The point that Milchek's trying to make is that his innie knows nothing about any of that pain. And I suppose I should point out that this feels like a new level of depravity from not only Lumon but also Milchek as an individual, who goes on to tell him that he's found love in there, without elaborating other than to say that the solace he's found will make its way to him if he gives it time. It feels dirty because it is, but of course we know he will decide to return because we've already seen that play out on the other side in the last episode. While most of this one is split between Mark and Helena, the two fired macrodats also have some significant developments. After Irv gets his bad news, there's a brief scene of him sitting in his apartment with radar. We see the paintings of the testing floor and him pulling the map with Britt's address out of his pocket. The next day, we see him walk to a phone booth near his place to make a call. The shot's set up from a distance, which makes it hard to hear what he says, but if you read the subtitles, you see him say, "You're not picking up, I get it. I want you to know my innie got the message." I guess this does confirm something I'd questioned since the finale. Is Irv working alone? But it's about as vague an answer as it could be. The most obvious possibility of who he's working with would be Ragabi, since we know she used to work at Lumon and is now working against them. But I don't think this points to her being the person he's trying to call in any significant way. That's the whole message he delivers, which I interpret as his innie saw the testing floor paintings when he woke up, but that's all we get for now. As he's leaving, a car pulls up and we see that it's Britt, and he appears to be following him. It's nighttime, it's dark, it's Christopher Walken, and he's keeping a distance to not blow his cover. The score and the look on his face make it seem like something sinister might be going on. But after thinking about this, it just as easily could be misdirection. These are their outies, who we expect met briefly after Irv woke up knocking on the door of someone that doesn't know him. He at least knows Britt is or was a severed employee. And the was part might be important because my guess is that Lumon forced him out when he retired, so he recently lost his job. I don't think it's a big leap to think he might be mad about that and go looking for answers about if the random coworker who showed up on his doorstep was connected to that. If that turns out to be the case, then I sort of love the decision to try to make this appear so creepy. If not, maybe Outie Britt is a psycho and Irv has other things to worry about outside of Lumon. While Irv's scene is full of intrigue, Dylan's reminds us just how disliked Severance is in the community at large. He goes for an incredibly entertaining job interview that seems like a lock before the prospective employer finds out he's severed. Discrimination ensues. This is one of those sequences where everything just works, making it the perfect interlude between Mark coming to terms with his grief and Lumon plotting to do more horrible things. It's also one where every setup and line delivery is so much fun that I have to resist just repeating the entire conversation here. I really have to make an effort. It starts with him having to psych himself up, something that you can see he's done before and suggests that he has some real experience doing this. The interviewer later confirms this by pointing out a long string of short-term employment before he landed at Lumon. While this is funny in a way that you expect from a Dylan scene, it's also our introduction to his outie. And from this detail, the conversation with his wife afterward, and his response to getting fired earlier, what is he going to tell his wife? It doesn't seem like he was motivated by tragedy to get severed. It seems to be a threat and something Devin bringing up Occam's razor earlier fits with. Maybe some of this stuff is simple. Maybe Britt is just a guy who lost a job and is looking for answers. And maybe Dylan is just a guy who is pretty unimpressive as an employee on the outside. That could transfer the stress to his wife, who sounds pretty great and supportive on the phone. The downer here is how well he rises to the occasion in this interview. He absolutely nails it. It's for a door manufacturer, and the owner takes his product seriously, commenting that it's hubris that Lumon makes their doors in-house. I think I recall Dan Erickson mentioning working at a door factory in an interview, so this might have some basis in reality. In the show, Dylan matches this Mr. Saliba's enthusiasm and reverence, and only slightly oversteps with the door prize joke. The back and forth about what age he knew he loved doors and which kind he would choose to be was perfect. And these two guys are essentially finishing each other's sentences while describing how much they love doors. The shot of these two sitting opposite each other with Adrian Martinez dressed up to look as much like Zach Cherry as possible created an expectation when it appeared in the trailer, and the scene delivered. The discrimination angle makes it make sense for him to go back, no questions asked, when Milchek comes to bring him his pineapple. That his family matters to him is in sync with why we think innie Dylan might be susceptible to the offer of family visitation after meeting his son during the first OTC. And since the voice on the other end of the phone is a known actor when his wife calls, we can expect her to play a part in future episodes. I'm not sure if who that is would be considered a spoiler, but this was one of the casting announcements I was looking forward to. That fills in the blanks about what happened to everyone after the OTC and how they all ended up back at work. Based on the titles of the first two episodes, it's kind of striking how little screen time Patricia Arquette has. She does get her moment and a seat at the table after the gala, but following the first episode, I think most people are focused on trying to look for clues as to whether it's Helly R or Helena we saw on the severed floor. I'm in the Helena camp, and nothing in this episode changed my mind, but I do think there's an intention to make it hard to be sure. I talked myself into being so confident about this that I started to wonder if it was something that wasn't supposed to play as a mystery. This was undermined slightly by an interview where the creator gave reasons that Heliar might lie to her co-workers about finding out she was a Negan when she woke up outside. This is one of the things that people who are in favor of it being the innie hold up as one of their reasons. I saw the interview and I didn't necessarily agree with what he said because I thought it was in conflict with the characterization from season 1, where one of the main points was that her innie wasn't scared of anything. But it does give the opposing view something to grasp onto, which means I suppose they want to keep people guessing. This seems like the right time to mention that this episode was directed by a first-timer named Sam Donovan, because these exterior shots of Helena walking to the conference room and everything else in the Bell Labs building and the parking lot for that matter all look fantastic. Of course, I'm saying a first-timer on this show. He has credits going back 2 decades, but the entire first season was split between directors Ben Stiller and Alfie McCardle, with the latter not returning for season 2, so this is the first episode that was helmed by someone else. Before we get to that long walk that's the opposite of Mark's first season stroll down the hall in every way except for how long it goes on, there's a brief shot of Helena looking out the window, touching her neck where the bruises from Helly's attempt to end their lives were. Mr. Drummond comes in first, and while his role is never defined, he appears to be high up in the company rather than just someone who works for Helena directly. Maybe his role is similar to Natalie's, but on a much higher level in the organizational hierarchy. He's followed by the current CEO, Jay Megan, who appears to have some things on his mind as he shuffles over to invade his daughter's personal space before dropping the fetid moppet and not saying anything else. He just sort of does a crazy eyes thing before leaving. If you haven't already looked it up, this aligns with the Egan's impulse to use archaic terms that more or less harken back to Kier's time. Fetid is a word you still hear on occasion to describe something with a foul smell. And moppet is a word for a young child I wasn't familiar with, but maybe it's made a comeback since its use peaked out at the turn of the 20th century. He is an old and weird dude, but what stands out about this exchange, and something more than one person I talked to who had seen it early brought up, is that it appears that she's heard him say this before. There's just no reaction other than addressing him as father, and then letting him go about his business. Helena has loomed large over the series, so it's a bit wild that this is the first time we've seen her in action beyond those video messages she sent to Helly in the early episodes. Not that it comes off as a big surprise, but she appears to be a force to be reckoned with. And just as Adam Scott does with Outie Mark, Britt Lauer does a great job of making Helena a separate and unique character. This is first apparent when she meets with Harmony. I already mentioned the great shot of her approaching. So I'll just add what a lucky break it was that they had a table this large on location. That sets up Mr. Drummond at the same table, but so far from the conversation that he looks funny sitting there waiting for things to play out. She starts by thanking Harmony for acting fast and then gets her up to speed. The severed employees involved are being dealt with while Natalie checks in with the media people who were in attendance. Lumon is willing to have Cobell back, and Helena apologizes when Harmony asks for one. She welcomes their contrition and, feeling satisfied, is ready to return to work on the severed floor. Helena explains the board has a different idea and offers her a promotion instead. She goes on to introduce a new Severance advisory board, which holds little interest for Harmony, and it's here that she realizes they really just want to bring her back to keep her close. That makes sense. That's another question I had when they fired her last season. Isn't she the kind of person that knows things that could create problems if she were to become their enemy? She brings this up directly, saying they don't value her or her loyalty, they fear her. Helena quickly points out in a very convincing manner that they fear no one. Milchek has taken her place and that's non-negotiable, and if they didn't hold her in such high esteem, there wouldn't be an offer on the very large table. Harmony isn't convinced and doesn't jump at the new offer as she did at the chance to return to her old job. She leaves saying she'll think about it without committing to return. From there, Helena dispatches Milchek to deal with the rebels. She makes a video statement to apologize for her behavior, which, in case you somehow forgot, was her shouting that the innies weren't happy down there and were also actively being tortured on the severed floor. The story she tries to sell is that she was drinking while on a non-Lumon medication, and while inebriated thought her comments were funny. After some reflection, she realizes that the things she says as a representative of her family's company affect the lives of a lot of people, and for bringing them into it, she's genuinely sorry. She ends by renewing her commitment and reminding people that she's also human, just like them, and just like her innie. It's completely BS, but also completely convincing. You realize that if this is who the innies are up against, they don't have a chance. And the character is actually a great actor when she needs to be. Surprisingly, things only get better from there, because as we watch Milchek ride around on his motorcycle, tracking down each of the other macrodats, Helena reviews the security footage of the goodbye between Helly R and Mark S, and perhaps more importantly, the kiss that they share. I found this super interesting because the character's introduction to this point has painted her as a cold, calculating, and somewhat dastardly person. So at first, it feels cruel that she's watching them like that to find things she can use against them. As it goes on, though, there are details like her laughing at the joke about the coupons, and then rewatching the kiss that give you the sense that there's some underlying jealousy involved when she thinks about her innie. There's a lingering shot of her sitting there thinking while she waits for Milchek to return. We watch as that happens and he pulls back into the lot, but the way she's sitting there thinking about the kiss and the freedom Helly has trapped down there in the prison that is the severed floor, there's something more going on there. It's a welcome development because, as I've said elsewhere, Helena replacing Helly on the severed floor essentially ends the innie story, which isn't very satisfying since we've grown attached to the character. With the other macrodats, reintegration is how they can survive beyond their work existence. But this has always felt like a stretch for Helena. If watching Helly is having an impact, then that opens things up for her Outie to experience change. Maybe there's even a path to becoming someone different, someone better who might be an advocate who can actually do something since she's on the inside. It's a lot to extrapolate from a few wistful looks, but I believe they're there for a reason and not something we should overlook. For now, she has work to do as a future CEO. And there's a brief meeting with Mr. Drummond and Natalie where they ask Milchek about the fake team he's putting together. Dario is apparently a floater from overseas, and we already knew that Gwendolyn and Mark W. came from a closed branch called 5X. When Mr. Drummond hears that, he looks surprised and says really, but doesn't elaborate any further. He also describes Devin as the more uppity of the siblings after eavesdropping on their conversation at Pips. Seth says he only had 48 hours to put the team together, which confirms that the 5-month thing was a total lie. In the end, Mark never even missed a day of work since it happened over the weekend. Milchek hopes there will be chemistry between the new team, but Helena isn't concerned about that. In another somewhat big reveal, she says they just need Mark back to work long enough to complete Cold Harbor. If you watched our live stream, you know that the idea that Mark must be important to Lumon came up. This doesn't answer the question of why they need him specifically or why this particular file, Cold Harbor, is vital, but it does confirm they're important to those at the top of the food chain in the Egan family. We know Gemma/Miss Casey is also involved because of the screen flash at the end of the last episode, so we're moving toward meaningful answers. When we see Mark in the parking lot this time before he returns, he's not crying, but he obviously has a lot on his mind. There's a montage of him coming and going from the Outie perspective for the few days he was working with the new team. Then Milchek is called to listen to the tape of the call to the board as innie made, and Mr. Drummond says they're going to give him what he wants, including Heli R. The reasoning is that they need him to finish this file, and he won't do it without them. I suspect Heli R truthers will point this out as proof that we really saw her innie in the last episode, since everyone at this meeting should be aware of the deception. There's not a great explanation for why he keeps the plan to replace her with Helena so vague, other than they want us not to be sure about what's really going on. After that, there's some pineapple dissemination, and when Mark walks in the next morning, we see Mark W. being escorted out by security while he threatens to sue. He shouts "fuck you Lumon," which sounds a lot like June's song from last season. We watch the MDRs go in one after the other, and the first time I watched this scene, I thought I noticed that the elevator sounded different when Helena went down, but the score completely changes when she enters the room, and after going back to check again, I can't say for sure if there's a difference. Whether or not there's a clue there, or if you can see her not change over, I still really enjoy the way they put this scene together, and the way the theme slowly builds as the team is reunited. In the final scene, Mark finally catches Cobell outside her house as she's apparently leaving. She has a suitcase, and she doesn't bother with her normal Mrs. Selvig routine, not for very long anyway. He gets justifiably aggressive. She mostly just keeps getting ready to leave and otherwise ignores him, but does return his energy of saying he ate her shitty cookies by bringing up how going back shows how easy to sway he is, and asking if a pineapple was involved. He's really wound up by the time she tries to drive away, and he runs into the street to stop her. As he's yelling, asking what it's all about, he notices something and takes a chance asking her directly if she knows something about Gemma. She doesn't answer, but you can see it land, and she looks down when he says that name. And it's almost as if she considers a response before she starts screaming and starts driving away. She ends up giving away something, and it catches him, and then the episode ends there. So this was another amazing looking episode, and now that we've seen both sides of things to set the table on the inside and the outside, I think we can say that the show hasn't lost a step. There are some really compelling things happening here, and while I'm not sure how long I want to see them delay reintegration, I do quite enjoy the back and forth between Mark and Devon. That also always keeps Rickon close by. And I suppose Mark could just float the idea of reintegrating to try to get her on board, but it didn't feel like that was what they were setting up here. The Helena stuff is a welcome surprise, as is the confirmation of Mark's importance. So I can't wait to see where things go next, and I think that's a great place to leave things. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. We'll be doing the live stream again tomorrow, Friday at 9 p.m. Eastern time, so join us for that. And thanks for watching. I'll talk to you soon.